Mr. Neuer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. I've come here from Geneva, from the headquarters of the United Nations Human Rights Council, to report to you on how that and other key UN bodies, as well as high UN officials, are engaged in the systematic demonization of Israel. Mr. Chairman, the United Nations was founded in wake of the Nazi atrocities. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was created in response to barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. On October 7th, Hamas sent thousands of terrorists to infiltrate into Israel. They broke into more than a dozen communities, massacred entire families, committing horrific and sadistic acts. They slaughtered 260 young people at a music festival. On that day in total, Hamas murdered more than 1,400 people. This was an act of sheer evil. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak likewise said, "The attacks in Israel shocked the world. Over 1,400 people murdered one by one. The elderly, men, women, children, babies in arms, murdered, mutilated, burned alive. We should call it by its name. It was a pogrom." Mr. Chairman, what one would expect the United Nations, likewise, to speak clearly and denounce barbarous acts which have shocked the conscience of mankind. Yet, this is not what has been happening. Despite some condemnations of Hamas, the overwhelming majority of statements by UN bodies and officials have been pointing the finger at Israel, expressly or by implication. The most excited and emotive declarations by the UN's highest officials describing suffering in Gaza are directed at Israel. Never does the UN blame Hamas for launching the war, for embedding themselves inside hospitals, homes, schools, and mosques. There are almost no such posts about the massacre of October 7th, about millions of Israelis subjected even now to rocket attacks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis displaced, more than 200 hostages being held by Hamas. All of these are not being championed in the UN's dramatic social media and statements. The target is always Israel. Now, often this is done by misrepresenting basic facts, such as falsely accusing Israel of bombing a hospital when the culprit was actually the Islamic Jihad, falsely characterizing Israel's legitimate self-defense aimed at targeting terrorists as, quote, collective punishment or other crimes, creating false moral equivalence between such self-defense and the terrorists, misusing numbers of Gaza dead, not telling us the source of the data is Hamas, not telling us how many of those dead are terrorists, including those killed in Israel, and pretending that proportionality is about comparing death tolls when in fact it's about using proportional means to achieve a valid military objective. Now, the UN Charter guarantees the equal rights of nations large and small, yet nowhere is this principle more violated than when it comes to the UN's treatment of Israel. At the UN General Assembly last year, there was one resolution on Iran, one on Syria, one on North Korea, and 15 on Israel. 0 resolutions were adopted on China, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and 180 other countries. At the UNGA, any resolution targeting Israel is passed by an automatic majority. This was on display 2 weeks ago when the GA adopted an Arab-drafted resolution calling for a ceasefire after, outrageously, they rejected a Canadian amendment that would have condemned Hamas for the massacre and demanded the release of over 200 Israeli hostages, including children, babies, and elderly grandmothers. So the text adopted by the GA failed to even mention the word Hamas, failed to recognize Israel's right and duty to defend its citizens against terrorism. Now, at the World Health Organization, every year its annual assembly deviates from global public health for a special debate singling out Israel. There is no such focus on Syria, where hospitals are repeatedly bombed by Syrian and Russian forces, nor on North Korea, one of the worst health systems in the world. On the contrary, the WHO recently elected North Korea to its executive board. Since the Hamas massacre, the vast majority of statements by the WHO have targeted Israel. Hamas is seldom mentioned. The director, Dr. Tedros, is posting numerous statements falsely implying that Israel targets hospitals. He fails to say that Israel's military abides by the law of armed conflict, expends enormous efforts to avoid harming civilians, while Hamas's strategy, on the contrary, is to embed itself inside hospitals, homes, schools, and mosques to use Gaza civilians as human shields. Likewise, 2 days ago, he posted a call for a ceasefire without any mention of the word Hamas. Israel's right to self-defense, to stop Hamas from carrying out their stated intentions by one of their top officials to repeat the massacre of October 7th was nowhere mentioned. At the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's serial abusers get a free pass. Many sit on the council, including Qatar, Kazakhstan, and Pakistan. Last month, they re-elected the regimes of China and Cuba. None has ever been censured. Last week, when the Human Rights Council opened its social forum, the chair was the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, while dictators are honored, a democracy is scapegoated. The only country in the world with a standing agenda item at the Council is not China, which denies basic human rights to 1.5 billion people, as you well know, Mr. Chairman, nor is it Iran, which beats, blinds, and poisons women and girls for protesting and which sponsors Hamas terrorism. Instead, the agenda item is on Israel. From the Council's creation until today, it's adopted more resolutions on Israel than on Iran, Syria, and North Korea combined. Not surprisingly, in the inquiry's most recent press statement on October 16th, they create a false moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, refusing to treat Hamas as a terrorist organization, refusing to affirm Israel's right to self-defense. Now, other officials need to be examined. Last year, the Council named Francesca Albanese as its special rapporteur on Palestine. The mandate is to investigate only Israel's violations. Ever since, Albanese has used her UN post to legitimize terrorism. Last November, she addressed a Hamas conference where she said, quote, "You have a right to resist." This is a UN human rights expert encouraging Hamas last November. 6 days ago, she led 6 other supposed UN experts to accuse Israel of attempting, quote, genocide. Finally, we need to address UNRWA, which in 2022 alone received $344 million in US funding. Under the slogan, "Peace starts here," UNRWA tells donor states that they educate Palestinians about human rights and peace, that they promote stability. Yet today we've released a new report, "Hate Starts Here," how UNRWA teachers indoctrinate Palestinian children and incite anti-Semitism. It can be found at unwatch.org. Our last report documented how UNRWA staff regularly call to murder Jews and create teaching materials that glorify terrorism, encourage martyrdom, demonize Israelis, and incite anti-Semitism. We had identified over 100 UNRWA teachers and staff found to promote hate and violence in social media. Our new report today examines how UNRWA staff reacted to the Hamas massacre. As soon as news of the slaughter broke, they immediately celebrated it on Facebook. "Allah is great, Allah is great. Reality surpasses our wildest dreams," posted UNRWA Gaza teacher Osama Ahmed. UNRWA principal Iman Hassan justified the massacre as restoring rights and redressing grievances. Rawia Hellis, director of UNRWA's Khan Yunis Training Center, featured in an UNRWA video, glorified one of the terrorists as a hero and a prince. UNRWA English teacher Asma Rafiq Kuhel called to sculpture the date, adding the emoji of a heart. UNRWA school administrator Hamada Ahmed posted, "Welcome to the Great October." Finally, there's an UNRWA official, Mohammed Al-Sheikh Ali. He features on our report on page 16. He recently posted the following: "Anyone who talks about taking refuge in Sinai is a traitor. Anyone who tries to flee to the south should be treated the way we ought to treat traitors." Mr. Chairman, in other words, we have someone identifying himself on Facebook as an UNRWA official with prominent photos of him receiving UNRWA awards, calling on Hamas to execute Gazans who want to go south to flee for safety to get away from Hamas. In closing, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, key bodies and officials of the United Nations are exploiting and distorting the language of human rights, the basic concepts of international law, in order to cast Israel as a racist and genocidal state, as the manifestation of infinite evil, even as it is trying to defend itself from one of the most horrific mass terrorist attacks of our time. At a moment when the world needs moral clarity and leadership, the UN has failed. Its actions only incentivize Hamas to continue their strategy of using Palestinians as human shields and maximizing casualties. The United Nations will never live up to its founding premise so long as this pathology endures. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Noor.